just want to make sure that that goes green. Yes. Okay. All right. And it looks like we are live. And it's automatic because Rachel set that up for us, which is fantastic.
Oh, nice.
Wonderful.
That's nice.
I believe the audio is working, everyone. Hi, everyone. Yeah, welcome to another Office Hours, everyone. As you probably worked out by now, I'm not Rachel. She's actually asked me to host today to make sure we don't miss a week in answering your community questions. And yeah, I hope you have lots of those because today we're actually joined by the spectacular research advocate, Vincent Warmerdam. How are you doing, Vincent?
Hi, my name's Vincent. I'm doing well. Hi.
Fantastic. So Vincent actually is working between developer relations and the research team. And yeah, and so you're pretty much kind of like breaking down barriers and like making these research topics or these complex research topics a bit more digestible for our community. You probably also saw him on the algorithm whiteboard. I always get lots of great feedback from that. And I think folks are, yeah, always love to see like these things being explained in this awesome kind of whiteboard doodling style that you have. I think it's super unique and awesome. Yeah, and so welcome to the stream. And I guess another exciting thing that just recently, recently was launched was Rasa 3.0, right? So exciting times for us.
Yeah, like that's like hours ago.
Yeah.
Not even a day ago.
Right.
But yeah, we're Rasa 3 old now, I guess you could say, which is yeah, exciting.
Yeah, 3.0. So it's a real big one. I mean, it's obviously a major update that we released. It contains lots of new features and quality of life improvements, and a big like architecture update as well. Yeah, and after like a lot of work, it's finally live. So our team has been working like doing lots of really hard work like to get it live, and now it's finally here. So it's super exciting. Yeah, and I think obviously with new. And I guess before we get started, actually, there's a few nice announcements that kind of came with that. Something also Rachel has been working on and DevRel team. There's actually lots of events that will come from next week. So I guess before we get started on some questions, I just wanted to make sure folks are aware that are joining today. Actually, thank you so much for sharing screen, Vincent, and sharing. It's actually Rachel announced that, obviously with a new version comes lots of new questions, and rightfully so. And so, yeah, there is organized for next week. Basically every day next week we'll have a live stream event, kind of deep diving into some topics, and yeah, really awesome like little schedule there for next week. And at the end we'll also be talking a bit more about yeah, community side as well. So there's so much. There's just actually so much going on next week. It's going to be super awesome for community. Cool.
Yeah, so what I'm doing, by the way, is I'm making a copy of the link and making sure that people in the stream can also just check it out. Basically, it's from our forum. Rachel's made a long post here. We have a couple of days with a couple of things for next week. So you can also pick and match. Like I can imagine maybe some features are more interesting for you than other features. But definitely check it out. There's like a full week of events and like live streams and everything. So definitely check it out.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely check it. I think one step further, shameless plugging, but of course, if you subscribe to the channel, then you also get notifications, and you can even find those links in each of the in the announcement, so you can set notifications if there's something in particular you're really interested in. But of course, our community is super global, and folks are tuning in from different time zones. So of course, it'll also be available for you on YouTube as well after. So yes, everyone will be able to access that. So yeah, really exciting times. So back to the main topic of discussion today, Vincent, who is joining us. Thank you so much for your time and taking time out of your also busy schedule to talk and answer some community questions today. I guess if anyone has any questions, feel free to just drop them in the chat. We'll answer them live. Any kind of questions on research, maybe there's some things that come into mind, maybe a bit for 3.0. Of course, we'll go into much more detail of that next week. But yeah, I guess one of the things we can maybe get started with, since I don't see any questions just yet, we talked about that earlier. Maybe it's worth to ask you, like, what is your favorite feature in Rasa, and if there's a change of that recently?
Yeah, so one of the things we're gonna do more of in 3.0 going forward is just like there are lots of things that we could do to make the developer experience just maybe a little bit better, and maybe also to encourage open source contributions just a bit more. And with that in mind, am I sharing my screen at the moment?
Uh,
Because that's
yes, I
it'd
can
be, it'd be
show.
kind of weird if I was sort of talking about the, like pointing to something and like
Yes,
wasn't
that's
showing
very
just one of
true.
it.
I switched. We can see your screen now.
Perfect, very good. No, so like some of the stuff that I'm currently working on involves this yeah, almost like hobby project within Rasa, but it's called Rasa NLU Examples. It's a project that I've been maintaining since Rasa 1.9, if I'm not mistaken. It has a couple of non-English features on it. Also, just a couple of interesting things that might make your assistant better. It's a bit of a researchy project. But what I've always wanted is that maybe some of these components come from us, and that's great. But we would like to get more feedback, especially from non-English languages. And one of the things that we have made a lot easier now is just some of the documentation around it. So as of Rasa 3.0, like the machine learning backend is a bit different. We are now using a proper graph to represent the machine learning. And what we've done is we've actually made a pretty big guide on the docs that explain to you how you can actually make these components yourself. Previous versions of Rasa could have done a slightly better job at documenting how to make your own custom components. But the graph architecture actually makes it easier for us to accept lots of weird and like experimental components that weren't as easy to write before. But we can also add more guides. So they're not just a migration guide, but also like a proper guide on how to make your own custom components. And if I have to think of like a proper favorite feature, it's probably stuff like this, like stuff that we can do to make it easier for people to solve their own problems, make a custom component, and maybe share that with the larger community as well. That's something I'm actually quite excited about because I'm pretty sure at Rasa we have clever people solving clever problems, but if we really want to tackle this idea of making virtual assistants work across the world, then we need more than just Rasa. We kind of need a bigger community around this with creative ideas. So this is something I'm actually quite excited about. Also, because this guide is helping me rewrite all of this, that's also something that I'll be picking up this month, because I do need to migrate my components to 3.0. There's a change that you will have to do. But yeah, that's my main observation. I think that documentation improvements are going to be great too this version round.
Awesome. Is it? But this is actually something also as a general project that you've been working on for a while, right? It's
Oh
something
yeah,
you're-
so the NLU examples repository. I mean, I've been doing that, I think, since version 1.9. I could be mistaken, but like some like I think the byte pair embeddings are supported by 275 languages, if I'm not mistaken. But there's also some tokenizer for the Thai language, and some of the people in the research team are also contributing some interesting ideas here. This is kind of like our experimental component library that's hopefully useful to other people, but it also makes it easy for us to just write a component, test it first before we move it into Rasa. So this is just something I've been maintaining on behalf of the community as well as the research team.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I think this is also definitely a really cool project and something that the global community can really benefit from. Obviously, we're growing very quickly across that, and I think like working together, we can also solve some of these challenges together and like collecting the data and examples. It helps breaking down the challenges. But yeah, I'm just I see some kind of chat going on as well in the chat here. And I guess I'll just start from the top. Although I'm not sure if it's quite more like a statement or how to ask this question, I'll just read it out, Vincent. Maybe you can give some value to that. So when we create the custom image for Action Server using GitHub Actions and Dockerfile, we're able to deploy in Docker Hub. Continued. But is that all the supporting files like data files we're also able to deploy with the image from Nick?
So the custom it depends a little bit on what you're doing. So just from the get-go, right? Theoretically, even if you don't use the Docker files that Rasa provides, then you are always able to write your own Docker file, and therefore you are always able to write it as custom as you like it, as long as the endpoint is compatible with Rasa. So in that sense, you can always write your own action server. The question that I do wonder about a bit there is how easy is that to combine it with our standard deploys? I haven't done that in a while, so I don't know the full details there. But yeah, data file, but you can just add data files to your action server. One thing I do want to mention is depending on how big your data file actually is, A lot of folks at some point use the action server to communicate with databases. The idea being that the data doesn't necessarily live in your custom action container, but lives someplace else. And then the custom action container is more like a thing that communicates to the database. That's a pattern we see a lot of. So I would consider that because it has some scaling benefits as well. But certainly, it's a Docker container in the end. So you're always very free and flexible what you put in it.
Nice. Does that answer your question, Nick? Did you try some of those things already? Cool. And hi, Amina. Nice to see you. Nice, thanks for joining the stream. Also from Navneet as well, I think maybe it's something to do with Rasa 3.0. Let me read it out. So, hey, I'm not going to raise anything regarding 3.0 as we still are waiting, but I would really like to point out something regarding compatibility issues we have been facing Rasa and Rasa X. I think like if you have some issues, I'm not sure if it's something, sorry, Vincent, you can touch on, but I would just say also where to go in case you have those issues. But do you have any points?
I do want to acknowledge that, I mean, we have also seen some compatibility issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of that has to do with some installation issues that are somewhat general, though. So what I would like to do now is just mention a couple of things that might help. I don't know if this will help you specifically, but in general, there are a couple of these things that we've noticed. One thing that sometimes is a breaking point is just installing the right software. Now, what doesn't help here is that pip, the standard Python installer, it had an update a while ago. So that means that the way that dependencies are being combined into your virtual environment, that has changed a bit. And that has also caused a couple of strange errors to appear, depending on the operating system that you're using. In general, I advised to make sure that you're using the legacy resolver and that you also upgrade to the most recent version of pip. Like, I don't want to say all of them, but about 50% of all the issues are related to dependencies in this sense. So you can get a long way by just debugging pip in that sense. Everything besides that, though, there are some concerns with different operating systems. For example, M1 chips have a lot of issues right now with TensorFlow, so that also causes some compatibility issues. And I have also heard stories about Windows users using Docker sometimes. For that, it tends to get a little bit more specific, and I would urge everyone to just start a ticket on the forum or look for similar examples on the forum, because there have been many fixes to many of these issues, but they usually tend to be a bit specific. A final thing that I do recommend, especially if you're working on your local machine, so it's a really, really annoying thing, but in Python, like if you type pip install, then you got to wonder where does that pip come from? That pip might come from your own virtual environment that you're intending on using, but it might also come from a global environment. And there are these edge cases that actually occur all the time. If you're using Jupyter, this happens all the time, where, for example, if you type Jupyter Lab, but Jupyter doesn't exist in your current virtual environment, it's going to grab the Jupyter from your global environment. If you then type pip install Jupyter Lab, once your virtual environment has already loaded the global Jupyter Lab, then you might be installing packages, but they might not be loadable inside of Jupyter because it's still pointing to the global environment. It's weird stuff like this that does make me sort of give one advice, and that is to always run python-m pip. That way, you're always sure that you're using the pip version from your virtual environment and never the global one. And you can do the same thing with Rasa. So you can run python-m Rasa. That way, you're grabbing the main entry point for the Python module, which is usually a lot safer because that way you're at least sure you're always installing in the environment that you're calling Python from. I actually made a whole course on this. Feel free to ask me about that if you're interested, but that turns out to be a source of lots of errors and frustration as well. Final thing I can kind of say about installation issues. Sometimes really is that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, really great insight, very detailed insight. So thank you, thanks for sharing it.
I've made a course on one of my blogs, and I'll just share it here in case people are interested.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
And also the thing I want to add there is installation issues with pip are pretty common. We're really sorry about everything, but don't feel bad if the installation issue happens. It happens to me all the time as well. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I just shared a link that might be helpful to some people.
Yeah, for sure. So all his insights, also, yeah, check out the links. And then if you're also still facing the issues, definitely reach out on the forum. As Vincent mentioned as well, it's obviously we'd love to hear about it. And yeah, if other people have the same issue, obviously discussing it in the same thread will help us understand like the priority and more people that are maybe facing the same issue. Cool. So Nick, Why port 5055 always restarting always on an exit 0 and exit 1, Rasa underscore at 1?
I need a little bit more context to give a proper answer there. So you're asking why is this like an auto restart flag, or is it you're asking why we've picked a certain port? Like if you give a little bit more context there, I might be able to help. But as is, I don't 100% know what you're asking there. I do see that Nick a little bit later is asking about the CI/CD process for updating data files which link to custom actions. And I do have a little bit of a comment on that. So this is what I'm about to say is totally not official, and it's something that I have been working on just to sort of explore it. But I have been thinking about ways to sort of unit test custom actions. It sounds like a really good idea to me that if you have custom code that's going to run inside of your assistant, that there's unit tests for them. So I do need to double check if I can find it, but I have been sort of toying around with a client library of like, hey, if we're going to do unit tests for custom actions, are there parts that we might be able to repeat? It might be the case that like there's something general about how you want to test your custom actions. And if that's the case, then it might be nice to have something of a client library for it. I think it was something like action examples. Yeah, there we go. If I could share my screen real quick. So again, this is more of a playground kind of a package that I've made. This is again, I'm exploring this. I'm not suggesting this is by any means like formal or official, but there is a repository that I've made called Rasa Action Examples. And the point of that repository is that we have a place where we can just have a couple of examples of, custom actions that might be useful in general. And if we have something that's useful in general, we can share it and learn from it. One custom action that I've made is the fallback button custom action. I'll just quickly show you how it works. There we go, actions. And the idea basically is in this one specific, this is a bit of a silly assistant. In this assistant, you can buy stroopwafels, and you can ask anything about stroopwafels. Stroopwafels are a Dutch cookie. I'm a big, so tangent, but best cookie ever. But the idea is that sometimes when the fallback classifier is triggered, that's an indication that we don't know for sure which intent you're actually interested in. Now, what this custom action then will do is it will say, well, whenever the fallback is triggered, then we're going to generate buttons that say something like, maybe you meant A, B, or C. And that's a little bit more than saying, hey, could you please repeat what you just said? And we can actually use the confidence that comes out of the classifier to sort of give an order to those buttons. Anyway, I have a custom action that's able to generate that. And if I recall correctly, if I go to my tests here, I also have a test fallback action. And this is just like a brain fart, I guess you could say, where I'm thinking about, hey, what might it be like if we have a client library to write unit tests for our custom actions? And the idea would then be like, hey, suppose that I have a client where this custom action is living in, and I were to give it this message. Can I confirm that the buttons are actually being generated in this one specific scenario? And are we also able to see the right text? I do think in general, having some unit tests like this will be a great idea. There's lots of moving parts in this because unit testing a custom action is not trivial. If you want to make a client library, that's not trivial. But I like the idea of experimenting a bit more with this. So if you are interested in doing more CI/CD with custom action stuff, feel free to check out this repository and drop me an issue if you have some ideas on this. But in general, CI/CD for custom actions, great idea. Should do more of it, I think.
Yes, I think I'll definitely do more of it on stroopwafels as well.
Yes, and more stroopwafels. Oh yeah,
yes.
Stroopwafels always good.
Always good, always good. Cool. I'm gonna jump back because Labib also asked a question. I think it might be relevant to the above question as well. Is it reverse compatible? I wouldn't want to rewrite all of my code.
Yeah, I think that
Sorry.
No, I think the question was asked when I was talking about the custom LU components that we now have for our graph architecture. They are not compatible in general. So if you want to have custom components in Rasa 3, you will have to make slight modifications compared to what you had before. There's a reason for it. The main reason is that before, like roughly in Rasa 2, we had a pipeline that actually resembled a pipeline. So step 1, then step 2, then step 3, etc. Now, for lots of awesome research reasons, which I don't mind getting into, but now we're saying maybe it doesn't make sense to do that in a linear sequence, because maybe like you can also look at it more as a graph of sorts. Could I share my screen real quick? Because I can do this better with a doodle.
Sharing.
Yes, thanks, Grand. But the thing is, like, usually you have your tokenizer, right? And then from the tokenizer, you might have your featureizer, and after that, you might have your classifier. And in Rasa, before in Rasa 2, you could say, oh, and there's also like an entity extractor over here, where we're going to be extracting entities, and it's like something we add behind the die classifier or something. In Rasa 3, the idea is you still use your same config file. So it's not like the user interface changes at all. But the idea is if I have an entity extraction tool that really only depends on the tokenizer and doesn't need the featureizer, then if we represent it as more of a graph instead of this linear pipeline, well, then theoretically, this entity detection tool could train in parallel as its featureizer. They don't have to wait for each other. And another thing that's kind of nice is it makes caching just a whole lot easier. If the featureizer changes, well, then we got to update the classifier as well, but we wouldn't have to change the entity extraction tool. So like all of these different components in your machine learning backend become a whole lot more compartmentalized, which has all sorts of performance benefits if you want to retrain your system, because you only retrain the parts that you need. A side effect of this is that we do have to rewrite some of our components, because the components that assumed a linear structure don't fit a structure that's non-linear and kind of more like a graph. I will say that in the longer run, there's also some other benefits to this. This is mainly related to end-to-end. If you've used that feature, we really want to push that feature for lots of reasons. But the main idea is that if we have a policy mechanism like TED, for example, well, then sure, we might in production get some output from the classifier because the intents are being used, but maybe we also use text data now. And if we want to use these features in our policy mechanisms, well, this already doesn't look like a pipeline anymore. It's a graph because parts are interconnected. And now if we actually have a system that's able to have components this way, then we can also say, well, maybe we want to have a policy mechanism that detects entities as well, or we want to have a policy mechanism that only works on NLU features and doesn't use the classifier anymore. So implementing all that stuff suddenly becomes a whole lot easier. The consequence of this, though, is that you will have to rewrite. Having said that, it's also not too bad. If you go to the documentation page, there's a full guide on how to write your own components, and you will also be able to find a migration guide that should be of a lot of help. And I should also mention, yes, you have to rewrite your components, but most of the methods stay the same. So I think one of the things is that we now have a method called process that accepts a list of messages as opposed to a single message. It's stuff like that. Like it'll take you like a couple of hours per component, but it's not necessarily 2 days work, I think. That's my experience so far, at least. I've converted some of my own components. It's not the worst. That is something I can confirm.
Nice, thanks for sharing. Yeah, thanks for the question, Naveed. Moving on to the next question. We've got a few already. Nick asked another one. So, is it mandatory to secure server IP DNS and then use it for channels, i.e. like socket IO or for Rasa X?
It depends a bit on how you set everything up. So if you are using, it depends on what you want to expose as well. And also, I have to admit, this is not my main area of expertise, but I believe what I'm about to say holds true in general. If you deploy Rasa X with Kubernetes, then Kubernetes can at some point say, well, there's traffic internal to the Kubernetes cluster, and there's stuff on the outside world that we actually allow a connection to. So it depends a bit on the channels that you use. How exactly you set up your IP and DNS is more related to how do you set up your IP and DNS for Kubernetes at some point, and how do you set that up for Rasa X? That is, if you use Kubernetes, which is what we do advise if you want to scale. So it feels like that's maybe more of a Kubernetes question than a Rasa X question per se. Having said that, though, I've never really used socket IO. The main thing that I would be mindful of in general is just that you have your certificates in the right order. So make sure that you use HTTPS and that sort of stuff whenever you make a connection to your Kubernetes cluster. Like that's the thing I usually would pay the primary attention to, so to say. But I need to admit at some point, I've never really used socket IO for Rasa X. That's kind of outside the bounds of my knowledge there.
If you give it a try, Nick, and it works out, there's no, it'll be good. Good to know in the end if you use Socket.io. Cool. And Amina asks, I'm building a chatbot in French and I have to downgrade to the Transformers version. So can I use Camembert, or do you think it is fixed with this release?
Oh, that's an issue I wasn't aware of. I would love to see a forum link or a GitHub issue on that. I was not aware that we had a Transformers bug there. Oh, one thing that I can imagine is that it might be related to TensorFlow, come to think of it. I don't know for sure, but I can imagine that the standard Hugging Face models that we support there are models that also support TensorFlow, because that way we can keep the containers light. If we need to have TensorFlow and PyTorch, container gets kind of big. But I don't know if there's a compatibility issue because of TensorFlow there. I would like to know more though. So definitely feel free to make a GitHub issue out of this, because I think we should be able to support Camembert out of the box. One thing I do want to say though, if you make the issue, could you also tell us why you think you need it? So far, I've seen situations where adding a heavy featureizer could help. But especially if you're interested in intent classifications, I gotta admit it's not been amazing. Like I've never really seen an assistant go from like 80% accuracy to 90% accuracy just because they added a featureizer. I have, however, seen that happen when they add more data, do more data quality, do more labeling. So if Camembert doesn't work, let me know, because we got to fix that. But one thing I would stress is you might not need it. That's the only thing I would like at least investigate. Like, do you really need Camembert to make your assistant performant? Because you typically don't always need it, is my experience, and it's better to be lightweight.
Yeah, that's another nice benefit. If you put it on a forum, then yeah, maybe we can suggest alternatives, like better ways to approach this problem as well. So
yeah, and one thing that's also maybe good to mention, if you use the Hugging Face language model featureizer that we have, the standard model that it comes with is called Labase, Labse. And that model is actually multilingual. Don't expect perfect behavior, because multilingual models also have downsides. But in general, that should also work with French. There's certainly been a sizable French corpus that went into the pre-training there. So if Camembert doesn't work, it might be good to check if maybe Labase does work.
Nice, thank you. And also nice to hear you're also building a bot in French. And
Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe one thing to add, because I see that there was an immediate response. I feel adding Camembert is the right thing to do. Smiley face, sticking tongue out.
Oh yeah.
So I get where it comes from. I do want to give maybe one bit of advice, because this is something that surprises a bunch of people. In my experience, when I add a featureizer, and then like the dense pre-trained featureizers, so think Spacey or like fast text or something like that, the main thing that I always notice is that the entity scores do kind of go up a little bit, like just a couple of percentages, like 3 to 5 maybe, depending on the data set, let's say. But the effect on the intent classification seems to be a bit lower. So I would say if you're really trying to use the diet classifier for entity detection, then it might make sense to think about featureization just a little bit more. If that's not the primary thing, I usually just forgo extra dense features altogether. This is just my personal experience, and I should say I've mainly been working in Dutch and English, so this might not apply to all languages. But I do think in general, a lot of these embeddings tend to help entities just a little bit more naturally, because sentences in chatbots tend to be short anyway. But if you make an embedding for like a single token, that can actually add a lot of meaningful information. Stuff that you might also see a lot in pre-trained corpuses. This is a bit of a theory on my end, not necessarily a benchmark fact, but I felt it relevant to share maybe. Might help some people.
For sure, yeah. I mean, the first approach, obviously, let us know about the issue and we'll look into it, because in the end it'll probably help other people as well. Maybe they're also running into those same problems, or future people that want to build bot in French in the future. But yeah, maybe also these other suggestions worth a little try. But yeah, I hope that helps.
In general, though, if you ever run a benchmark for French, I really want to stress that, like, share it, because we're interested in benchmarks, especially for non-English, like genuinely, because it is a concern of mine that a lot of NLP is really hyper-focused on just benchmarking on English. which might mean that we're overfitting on the wrong language if you're dealing with French, because you might need a different approach. I would love to sort of learn more about French use cases on the forum, so feel free to share.
Yes, it would be awesome. Great. Yeah, keep them coming. Any questions? Vincent could definitely give some more details, shed some more light on it. And we have another question from Nick, who's asking, my action server image is on a server and data is on GitHub, and when we query from chat widget, how will the response return? Or do I have to manually copy all the data in the app to support the action server?
Again, it depends a bit on the data, but I would just copy it in the Docker container that has your action server. That way, it should GitHub ever go down, you're not bothered by it. It depends a bit on how big your data set is, though. Like if it's gigabytes, at some point I would just put it in the database instead. But especially if you're starting out in the beginning and it's not, and let's say it's a name list or something like that, feel free to just put that in the app folder inside of a Docker container. Don't see the harm from this end.
Yes, thank you for all the questions. Lots of lots of questions on this, but this is the perfect place to ask. So thanks for all the questions. And Amina says thanks for the help, Vincent. So
merci beaucoup.
That's very good French. In the meantime, since maybe we're waiting for some more questions, just of course, just throw them in the chat. Anyone that has anything, of course, all questions welcome. Like really, any questions, don't be afraid to ask. I guess another question in the meantime, if we wanted to talk maybe a bit more about some other experimental repositories that you have, or features, or anything that you have going on, Vincent, because I know you have many experimental things happening, and maybe people don't know about them.
So there's actually something related to French that I'm working on,
Nice.
since we have someone for French in the audience. I'm sharing my screen now again.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So what I am going to show you right now is also very much experimental, not official, but like something that I think might help a bunch of people. So it started when a community member asked me to review a virtual assistant a while ago, and this was on a mobile phone. So I was typing and I noticed that I kind of have like fat thumbs, and I kept on making typos, and these typos were causing all sorts of problems because the assistant didn't really well, I mean, like if you look at the keyboard, right?
It is.
That's kind of if you were to type let's say I don't know, the word world. If you were to spell not world but words, you kind of get like the S instead of the D. It starts to sound like a different word, and then the computer at some point might say, hey, that's a different token. I don't know what this is. So you could argue we might want to start thinking about ways to make NLP systems less brittle against spelling errors. Now, typos are just one kind of spelling error. But what I've made is a little tool called Typo. And the way it just kind of works is if you were trying to press the letter K here, odds are that the typo is probably going to be like the keys around the letter K, as opposed to maybe a letter on the other side of the keyboard. So if we use that as a heuristic, so to say, one thing that we might be able to do is we might be able to say something like, well, we can maybe simulate keyboards typos. So one of the things that this tool that I made can do, called Typo, is it's able to generate typos on your behalf. So if, for example, you had a NLU file that kind of looks like this, where it asks, are you a bot? Are you a human? Am I talking to a bot? I can use the keyboard layout to simulate it to become, are you a human? Or am I Ralkung to a human, for example? The idea here, and I've done some experiments with this, it's pretty interesting, but the idea is that you kind of have typos that you may or may not want to overfit on, but you also have more training data as well. So you could make the argument that maybe what we're doing here is also a generalization trick. We have more training data that maybe we do want to fit on. So maybe we can also just get better test performance, even if we don't have typos in them. So far, all the experiments that I've been doing suggest that this is actually a neat trick. It could totally work. The only downside is that if you do this, you might just go ahead and double your training data, which might also mean that you more than double your training time. The problem is that it's not just that you have twice as much rows of data, it's also that you have way more tokens. Like if I think about all the words in your vocabulary, suddenly the word Juman also appears, and the word Rolkung also appears in your vocabulary. So that means that your neural networks have to be way wider to accommodate for like all the different weights for those features. And that really can slow down the training procedure. I have seen training procedures that you double the training data with spelling errors, and the training time is like times 4 or something like that. I'm investigating ways to make that lighter. But for the French users, and that's something that I would love to get feedback on, I've also noticed that simulating typos is different across languages. And that's because in French, you have the letter E, E. I mean, you have all of these, in Dutch, we would call them rooftops for the letters, but you have all these different accents that you put on them. The Dutch accent also has some of that because Dutch is influenced by French. But the question is, how do you simulate a accent typo? Because usually that involves a shortcut on your keyboard, something like Shift Alt and then a character. And simulating that is a little bit tricky. One thing that I am exploring right now is to say, well, what you can also just do if you want to simulate typos is just remove the accent. I can imagine, especially on mobile phones, users are maybe a little bit more lazy, more prone to just write whatever their fingers are doing, and therefore a little bit more lazy. So like removing accents could be a other way of introducing typos, so to say. But in general, I would love to be able to do this in more languages because right now we really only support English. The tool supports a couple of languages, but it doesn't support these accents at the moment that I'm using. So I would love to just get more feedback on this because I do think this is a pretty interesting way of data augmentation that could be useful for like the wider Rasa audience. Super experimental though, so feel free to like explore that yourself because it may or may not work. I don't want to give a guarantee. And then the final thing that I think is just pretty epic about this repository, Andreas Daiminger, he made a PR request for this repository because I misspelled the word misspelling, which I just thought was kind of a cool thing about being on GitHub. Was like people still have humor. Oh my God, I have a repo called typo, which is misspelled, and when in sort of the subtext that explains why it's called typo, I've misspelled the word misspelling. Just figured that was kind of a cute little detail. Anyway, and a speech. This was my TED Talk.
For sure, I really love this repo too. I like that you always come up with the best like repository names as well. Always on point with the names. I mean, it actually has another question. So at which point do you start building a folder that contains rules, another one for stories instead of having files, and can we do the same for the domain? And she just mentioned quickly, I started doing it since there's a lot of rules and it's easy to manage like this.
Yeah, no, so that, great. Well done. Keep doing that. As far as I'm aware, but I could be wrong because I'm not in the engineering team, but as far as I'm aware, I think the domain file cannot be split up. It's my impression. I could be wrong, but I believe that's the one file that we cannot split up. The NLU and rules files we can. So this might make sense if you have, let's say, a lot of FAQ kinds of stuff and you just want to have one file for that. It can be a whole lot easier just to deal with one file as opposed to sort of with a couple of files that each have their own theme than to have to deal with one file with like thousands upon thousands of examples. So splitting up files, definitely great idea. I would try to think ahead of like what's the most logical cluster because you don't want someone to say, oh, I have this intent in mind, but I cannot find the file that it's in. Like you kind of want to put a constraint on that. But I use like the moment that my assistant is like a little bit further and there are multiple people working on the project and they all want to be able to add labels together, but we are in the same team. Like at some point, there's this moment where you say, hey, how can we formalize this, make this a bit more structured? But typically that's a bit more of a team conversation, is my experience. Because then you have to start thinking like, hey, what's the most maintainable way of keeping our data together? And usually from that comes, hey, we have a couple of NLU files that we just want to sort of split up. I don't have a good anecdote for story files or rule files. Most of the stories that I know are more about the NLU files. But I think the general rule would apply, like try to cluster it. Just make it easy to find and easy to adapt. I think that's the main goal when you're splitting up these files.
Nice. I hope that answered your question. I mean, and she also mentioned that I think it's the typo repo is super interesting, and she'll have a look at it, and will also keep us posted on the forum. So thank you. That's
Grand.
yeah, that would be awesome. Yeah, definitely. Especially like you mentioned, any contribution, especially on other languages, it's like a huge benefit to community in general. For others that maybe come a bit later that are also interested in French, or if there's also some English examples or any other languages, definitely very welcome, right? We can contribute any language to this repository. That's right, Vincent?
So
what you're looking for.
So any feedback in general will be super useful. The thing is, I've built typo on top of this tool called NLP Aug, and NLP Aug supports, I think, 10 languages from the get-go. So I do have, like, if NLP Aug doesn't support it, I don't support it just yet. But if people have ideas, but if people have ideas, they are super welcome. And the main thing I want to sort of be mindful of here is I don't speak all of these languages, so to some extent, I don't know what I'm doing. However, if people could point me in the right direction, what I do want to do is just implement it such that you don't have to. I do want this spelling correction feature to be something that we can all research. So I do want to make it as easy as possible for the world community to sort of try this out, because I do think typos are an important problem. If we're dealing with texts that are super short in our virtual assistants, then we do want to learn as much as possible from each and every character, even if it's misspelled. That's kind of more the attitude on my end.
Okay. Do you know what those 10 languages are, or is it like basically up till 10, or?
We can so if we can look live.
Okay, I'll share this.
Think. So shout out to NLP Aug. This is the library that I am using on top. Sorry, this is what I'm building on top of. But what I can also just do real quick is go to the typo library, go to the documentation, and if I go to the API and go to the keyboard simulation bit, then 10 languages, I listed them: German, English, Spanish, French. I believe this is Italian, Dutch, Polish, Thai, and UK English. Oh, Ukraine, I think.
Yeah, Ukraine.
HE. I don't know that one from the top of my head, but we should check it. HE ISO language.
I should know this one too. Is it not? I don't know what that is.
HE. Oh, right. Space HE. Let's go to bpemp.org because they have. So
this turned into a tutorial of how to find the language abbreviations. Actually, really helpful for me.
Yeah, well, so it's actually a lot harder. So, yeah, there we go. Hebrew, that's the one.
Right. Okay.
By the way, this is the library for BPM, which is for byte pair embeddings, and these have been trained in 275 languages. Certainly not all language codes are here, but at least there's 275. So there's a pretty good chance that it's around here, and you can explore different embeddings with like a very fancy chart, and you can see what's in there. But that's a bit technical though. But it also supports Hebrew supposedly. I don't know exactly how they simulate the typos, but it's what I'm building on top of, at least.
Oh, cool. Sorry, I think we're probably a little bit delayed on the stream, but yes, you got it right. I know we will probably hear this a bit later, but yes, 10 points.
Yes, yeah 10.
Exactly. You got there faster than we did, I think.
Well done there. Yes. But yeah, no, but spelling errors, I think it's an interesting problem. I do want to also maybe mention that typos are a special case of spelling errors, right? So there's also like phonetic errors. Something sounds the same, therefore we write it the same way, and it has nothing to do with the keyboard layout. That's just because the phonetics of it. There are also some interesting things that you have in Greek. I now have a Greek colleague who's been able to explain that to me. So in the Greek alphabet, you have this. It looks like an X, but I believe you pronounce it as like the mathematical symbol chi. So it's like an GH kind of a sound. But sometimes people like to misspell that on the keyboard with a Latin X, because that way you don't have to switch keyboards. And it's not phonetic, but it is visual. So it's like a visual typo, so to say, between different languages and between different alphabets. That also happens. So yeah, the joy of spelling error research. There's a lot of stuff here, stuff to do still. So should people be interested?
It's a nice insight. But yeah, that's the kind of things that this will be useful for. So that's really helpful. But yeah, any more questions, let us know. I have also, I mean, we could probably still talk about some experimental features that you have running. I have a question though. I don't want to raise expectations, but I wondered, is there a kind of like dream feature that you would love to have? Like anything that you ever kind of dream of that would be like just an awesome thing to have?
Well, I mean, so there's stuff that I dream about, but that's also stuff that I'm currently building.
Right.
Right. So there is some stuff that I'll be working on that actually that might be interesting. So like don't like I will not have this ready before December ends. Like that's just sort of putting it out there. Right now I'm focusing on educational content. And I want to make sure that all of our, tutorials are up to date as quickly as possible. Like we want you to be able to write in 3.0 within a week. And I think within a week or two, like all of our tutorials should be up to date as well. So that first and foremost. After that's done though, right now Rasa's great. We're able to scale it to thousands of users if you have your Kubernetes thing plugged in. But one thing that I also want Rasa to be able to keep on doing is just be this interesting little chatbot you've made for your own Slack app. Like I would love for people to write their own assistant for one user, namely me. Like you write your own assistant. I think that's an awesome use case. And keeping that in mind, then at some point being able to scale is less interesting. In that scenario, being able to keep it cheap is more interesting. So how can we maybe get some more lightweight models into Rasa? So I already implemented a scikit-learn based logistic regression classifier, which is one of the lighter things that you could do. I'm also talking with some of the research members, sort of we're exploring hashing tricks to maybe make this typo spelling thing a little bit cheaper to run. So the idea is maybe we don't have to build a full vocabulary. Maybe we can hash each token before we actually store it somewhere. That's going to be interesting because that also will help keep models really lightweight. So that's some stuff that I'm working on. Like, what can we do to make Rasa as light as possible if you're interested in running this on your own server? Because if you write it for yourself, then the demands also kind of change a little bit. Maybe it doesn't have to be the most epic assistant for everyone in the world, but just for you. So your vocabulary pardon can be much smaller, and that turns it into a nice little game of can we add components to Rasa such that it's light enough to run on like a $250 a month Vultr VM, like a really lightweight little server in the internet. I mean, it's still tricky to build that, but I think that's kind of a cool area of research as well. Like, how can we make things that are super, super lightweight? Another thing that I'm just going to be curious about to benchmark is just what would happen if I have a single component that's just a spacey model. Because technically that can do tokenization, featureization, entity detection, and classification. So like maybe that's a nice little way to just have your entire Rasa pipeline in a single component. I have no idea if that's going to work, but it might be more lightweight. Like that's an area that I'll be focusing a little bit on, I think, next quarter as well, because there's just a lot of really cool things that community people can do if we can just turn it into a lightweight personal kind of a thing, or maybe like a team thing. Like that's something I'm also pretty excited about. Like if you were to make your own Slack bot for your own team, what's interesting about that is also like the psychology of it. Usually, like the typical deployment for Rasa is like, hey, I've got customer service and we want to be able to automate some stuff there. Very good service idea, right? Like you might be able to do some good with that. It's great. But there will always be this kind of distance between the end user and the person who's designing the assistant. I think it's going to be much more interesting if your little engineering team, you're all designing the assistant and you're all using it. I think that's also like an interesting thing to sort of explore. Like, what would it actually be like if the user and the designer of the assistant are the same person? There's something about that I think is also like maybe more on a psychological level interesting to see, because I can imagine the development workflow also changing immensely because of that.
I love all these answers to the questions. I mean, obviously, like refining it and having it lightweight. I think this is also really great for community. As you said, it's like a really nice goal of making it more accessible, the more people can use it, and it's really great. But also, like the amount of things that you just came out with, because I watch your dream. I have many dreams, and I really love that motivation from you, Vincent. I mean, you always have so many ideas.
and of course, we got to continue Rachel's idea, but that we actually get like a chatbot for pets. I mean, that's also something we got to do at some point. Just got to get funding.
Yeah, I think so. I think actually this is one thing we've been talking a bit more about right recently, like having what kind of bot examples or things that people would like to see, or like as a really good use case or more common use case, or something that could help them really just get started and break into conversation area as well, and having their first bot. So we're also looking for feedback on that too, right? In general, if there's something that you're interested in, if a Slack bot, for example, that you can use with your colleagues is also something interesting, we're also interested to get some feedback. Maybe at some point we could do a poll, but we can see about that.
Yeah, so another area that could be interesting is just the idea of, can we make an assistant that you can just copy? So like, what's the most general Slack, like kind of like a cookie cutter template for Python? Like, so it would be nice if we have a user interface that sort of says, hey, what kind of a Slack bot do you want to have? Okay, I want to have Spendesk support. I want to have Bamboo HR support. Here's a couple of apps that I just want to be able to send questions to and get answers from. And then we'll just generate the template, and then you can add some labels yourself, and you're good to go with your own Slack bot. I mean, there's so much cool stuff. There's just a lot of cool stuff that we could do there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm really happy that you're also so excited about these things. I mean, I think it's stuff that also community is really interested in. So, well, watch this space. Like, it's stuff that you're obviously still working on. Like, there's no promises on the stuff you're saying, but there are a few things there that you mentioned that you're actually working on. So that's quite exciting.
I like to think so. I think there's also one extra question from Amina.
Yeah, she asked, I'm using a lot of buttons. Can we have a multi-choice kind of display? Instead of only one click, you can choose 2 or 3.
Yes and no. So the thing is, it depends a bit. If you are building this on your own website, then you can build your own UI framework, and you're totally free to do whatever you feel like. If you are using, let's say, Facebook or Slack, then you are going to be constrained by whatever user interface they provide. So if Slack doesn't support multiple choice kinds of displays, then we can also not display them. That's just kind of a fact of life. I can imagine the web being a more popular deployment framework going forward. One might imagine maybe Facebook or Slack also updating their UI elements at some point. But the short story still remains, if Slack doesn't support it, we cannot provide it in Slack. We might provide it on the web, but we cannot provide it inside of Slack.
I didn't think about that, actually. I see that as a bit of a challenge.
No, it's a constraint. It's if Slack had an amazing Pokemon GIF generator theme thing, that would be great for my Pokemon generated fan fiction chatbots. But if they don't, they don't. So then there's other ways of going about it. One thing I do want to encourage is people maybe consider buttons more, because I do think in general, clicking a button can be a lot faster in a lot of UI scenarios than typing yes. So the more that you could do with buttons is stuff that deserves experimentation.
So she asked as well, so I can fix it in adding a lot of entities in one payload.
So you would, I think with buttons, depending on what you're doing, you may want to add intents instead, but it depends on the UI framework. But yes, if the UI framework does support it, you should be able to just add with the buttons. I think Slack doesn't support multi-choice though. And also I think in general, because actually there's something else that happens as well. It depends on how you design the form, because the question is what comes back to the bot. Typically in Rasa, when you press a button, now that I think of it, you also send something back to the server, namely the payload. And by the time you press the second button, the first payload has already been sent. The moment the first payload has been received, there's also a response that's being generated. So for example, if we have buttons that said, hey, what topping would you like? And you say, I want to have mushrooms. Then by the time you hit the second button for, mozzarella, the server has already received mushrooms, basically. So in that sense, what you might want to do is more of a UI where you say, hey, what flavors would you like? You'll click one thing that you like, and then we generate a new prompt with remaining buttons of would you like to add anything else? Basically because the server also needs to respond back, because otherwise we don't know when to send a response back, because we need to know like a user pressed something, so we have to send something back. I would love to see a forum post with more details if you have any.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. Cool. Thank you for your question. Yeah, I think we have also just a few minutes left, so I guess it's like final call. If you have any like burning questions, anything you want to ask before we wrap up, please just throw them into the chat. Vincent's happy to ask as well, happy to answer them. Yeah, I guess as we kind of come to wrap up, I just wondered, is there any final things that you're maybe want to do a shout out for, or if there is anything, any other repository on top of anything you've mentioned that you'd love to have contributions for, or?
So there is one thing, I suppose. Yes, if you could share my screen again. Yeah. So again, this is the NLU examples repository, right? So this is, a bunch of examples are in here. One of the things that is also in here, if you have a look at the data folder, is we have name lists. And here's the thinking. So a lot of people want to be able to detect names inside of a virtual assistant. But detecting names is super hard because, well, let's say that I live in the Netherlands. I could have a list of baby names in Dutch, but no, French people can also move to the Netherlands, right? So I also need to, have French names that I'm able to detect, so to say. Oh, and I can also have German names, and the list keeps going on and on and on. So sometimes it makes sense to figure out what's your demographic and just make sure that you have a bunch of baby names to just do string matching on. So what people are also able to do is just contribute local names from their government, so to say. So people are sometimes going to government websites to get the official baby name list of Belgium or Italy, or I got some in Turkish and I got some from the USA as well. But this can be a really easy way to contribute a name list. If you do, there is one thing that I do appreciate. Feel free to add a name list, but also add a README that contains a source. That way, if there's ever a dispute on the accuracy, then we can at least point people to the original data source as well. But it will be if I want to do name detection, adding these name lists are also like a genuinely useful thing to do. And I believe I'm still in the market for a French name list. So if you have any, do let me know.
Awesome. Yeah, this looks really, really cool. I really like as well that we have so many things going on. Like I said it again for like the 5th time today, that we have a very global community, and it's nice that we have lots of things happening as well, to kind of start to understand our community more and like to provide more tools and more work with the community to try to improve the tools with them as well, with them and for them. So awesome. I guess so. We have just a couple of minutes. I just wanted to mention again one final time that we have like lots of events coming up next week on the channel. So of course, thank you so much for tuning in. If you're interested to learn more about 3.0, there'll be lots of events happening next week. Basically a stream every day next week. We already have them kind of scheduled on the YouTube channel, so you can already like flick through and see if there's anything you're really interested in. And yeah, I believe also, Vincent, you're also hosting one of these events. Which day are you hosting on, and what's your topic?
I'm hosting. I might be dropping by to your thing on Thursday, I think. But,
on Friday,
I'm
yeah.
also Friday. That's the one. I'm also joining a seal on the success markers feature. Success markers are genuinely a new way to think about how to measure success inside of your virtual assistant. It solves a lot of problems. Feel free to definitely check that one out. There's a lot of good we can do with that.
Yeah, for sure. There'll be lots of details as well. And you said SEO is also going to be joining you from our team.
Seal's actually been implementing that, so yeah, for sure.
Yeah, she's joining. Yeah, so she's implementing that. She's joining. Well, that's the thing, right? That's what's the best part about it. She's actually the one implementing it, so it's going to be an awesome episode because she'll just tell you exactly how this is working.
and also just to sort of be very clear about it, I'm joining a seal. Like, she's not joining me. Like, I'm there to support her.
Oh, so she's hosting. So you're there to support.
She made it. Like, she deserves to get a little bit of attention and thunder for like that work, right? And also, like, it's not just the seal. We have a bunch of people who've worked on that feature, but I do like the fact that we've chosen to give the spotlight a little bit to the people who also made the tool, right? So
yeah, absolutely. That's one of the great things about next week. We have spotlights on pretty much all the folks that are the main folks that worked on these features. So that's that's actually the cool part about the events, that that you'll be able to speak with and like I guess interact with the folks, or at least there'll be videos as well, and kind of deep dives from the people that actually really crafted these and put a lot of love into these features. So yeah, it'll be a great week. Cool. So yeah, thanks a lot everyone for tuning in, and then until next week, I believe it'll be a special episode, Office Hours with Ty. So until next week.
Looking forward to that.
Yes. Ciao guys. So everyone.